Hello and welcome back, and that's right, it's time for our review of the Firecuda 530, an SSD that, let's be honest, I've been banging on about for months, haven't I? Of all the SSDs that I talk about on this channel, when I talk about data storage a lot, it's not all about PS5, although it feels that way recently, doesn't it? I talk about NAS, talk about DAS, talk about Thunderbolt, talk about hard drive, talk about SSDs, talk about storage in general. But very occasionally, very occasionally, something comes along that makes me kind of go, whoa, this industry changes fast. And one of the products that did that, just under 2 months ago, was this, the Firecuda 530. The reason when I first saw it, I was kind of like, whoa, things are changing rapidly, is because it kind of challenged a lot of accepted norms of what we think of as hard drives and SSD storage minimums. I think a lot of the time when we look at the way storage has changed over the last couple of decades, you know, a decade ago, 2 and 3 TB drives were like, whoa. And before that, the idea of a terabyte of storage was unheard of. I think the maximum, I think I mentioned it in another video, was about 320 gigabytes. But to go from there with a paltry 100 megabytes per second to a drive that can clock on at 7,000 megabytes per second sequential read, remember, big files, is kind of breathtaking. But not only that it exists, but as you can see here from the bottom corner of the screen, that is actually quite a crowded marketplace. Seagate and their Firecuda 530 series is by no means the first drive on the market to crack the 7,000 mark. Indeed, if you want to look at commercial availability, they're probably about the 13th or 14th SSD that you can buy right now that's arrived, I hate seagulls, that has arrived on the scene with support of 7,000 megabytes per second sequential read. All of these other SSDs have arrived as early as last October and November in some cases, and all the way through till now in the recording of August 2021 when this has arrived on the market. So in today's review, I'm going to look at a couple of key things. Not just performance, although there will be disk benchmarks on Atto, on AS, on Crystal Disk, AJA, all of that stuff's coming later. But on top of that, I want to talk about, is this drive too late? Has it arrived on the market in a kind of, oh, here we are to save that? Oh no, you're fine, someone's put out the fire already. And I think that's the big question here for this drive, because let's be upfront about it, it's actually a little bit more expensive than nearly every drive here on the table. It arrives at 500 gig, 1 TB, 2 TB, and a cracking 4 TB drive, but each tier kind of costs a little bit more than everyone else. So another thing we want to ascertain in this video is it worth the extra money, and why is it worth the extra money? I've talked about it in other videos, but not in the review. Now, I want to chuck a disclaimer straight off the bat and a heavy plug for another website. Today's review is going to be utilizing the 500 gigabyte model of this SSD. So do bear in mind that the performance benchmarks later in the video, although the read performance should still be at that 7,000 mark, we hope the write is going to be much less. All of these SSDs that we talk about in PCIe Gen 4, the write performance in sequential write or 4K write is always going to be lower at the lower capacities. If you want to find more information about the larger capacities and the performance benchmarks they can give, I strongly recommend an article that we alluded to last week on our news roundup of the week. Tweaktown were one of the first websites to get a full review out on this drive, and there is a great performance benchmark and review over on Tweaktown. I'll link to it in the description. I recommend you check that out if you want to see the bigger capacities. But we're going to talk a lot more about this drive, the motivation behind it, and the hardware capabilities in today's video. So the 500 gig model, this does arrive with largely the same architecture in almost every other way. It is a PCIe Gen 4x4 SSD, taking advantage of that potential 8,000 megabytes per second bandwidth that it provides, and can hit 7,000 megs, they say. I'm looking forward to finding that out. It also takes advantage of NVMe 1.4 revision, so again, we've got all the tweaks and improvements there to make sure that our performance is tippity top. What's really interesting, and I've mentioned it in other videos, is unlike the other SSDs here on the table, this one takes advantage of 176 layer 3D TLC NAND. The result is not only is that performance lovely and high, but on top of that, the endurance and durability of this drive is pretty high too. And it's very important to bear that in mind, because Seagate are making a big thing about the durability of this drive. They know that there are a lot of other PCIe Gen 4 SSDs out right now, and the marketplace is a lot more saturated than they probably like right now at the release of their drive. But at the same time, their focus, they're saying, is durability. The idea that not only are you going to get this high-end performance, but you're not getting that high-end performance at the cost of durability. A lot of people aren't aware that SSDs wear out. If you didn't know that, spoiler alert, they do. They're not as enduring as hard drives or archival storage. And when the higher performance is introduced to these drives, that is detrimental to the NAND inside. And not all SSDs that can provide 7,000 megabytes per second are created equally. And indeed, if you have an SSD that is pushing tremendous performance constantly, if the NAND inside isn't highly durable, your SSD is going to run out. It's going to fail. It's going to effectively stop working if you're going consistent daily routines on that SSD. Now, the Firecuda here, the Firecuda 530, we have tested this SSD in PS5 as well. It worked absolutely fine. It even outpaced the PS5's internal storage as well. Do recommend you check out that video. It went live a few days ago, I believe. But the SSD and the NAND inside this is largely what Seagate are banking on with this. It may not have come out as early as these guys. It may not have come out as a lower price point as these guys, generally arriving at something like 10 to 12% more expensive against all the other SSDs out there per capacity, but they are banking on that durability there. The idea that even if you're not hammering this drive every day, that it will last way beyond the 5-year warranty on these drives. I think it's important. A lot of people who are looking at buying SSDs, and I mentioned it in reviews for both the Aurorus and the Rocket 4 Plus in the last week or so, that when you buy an SSD, it comes with a warranty period. Generally, any SSD worth its salt should have 5 years of warranty. However, there's a little caveat there at the bottom if you scroll down to the T&Cs, where it basically says it also is linked to terabytes written, how much data can be written to these drives throughout their lifespan. And if you exceed that number, it overrides the warranty period. They are saying with Seagate that their drives can take more data and, throughout their lifespan, maintain that performance, because that's the other detrimental effect of SSDs with constant write activity, that generally as the NAND slowly wears away a bit, hence why flash servers are more utilize anti-wear policies on their systems, where they sort of distribute the utility and the way things are accessed over time. SSD NAND, as it wears down, lowers the performance over time. So a drive that today can provide 7,000 megabytes per second may not hit 7, it may not hit 6.5, it may not even hit 6 a few years down the line. And that durability is kind of why Seagate are making a big deal on this. I did wonder why it took them so long to release it. When you think about it, they weren't the first to introduce the Phison E18 controller either on this SSD, something I talked about at length. Indeed, here on the table, although the Samsung 980 Pro and the WD Black, who are, they're getting a lot of plugs, all of them in this video, they use in-house NAND development teams and in-house controller development with the WD Black controller and the Ellipsis, whereas Aurorus and Sabrent both use the E18 that is present on the 530 here. So again, what are they bringing to the party? What does that NAND mean? Is it more to it than that? And it really is, because on top of that, alongside performance benchmarks at the 1, 2 and 4 TB that largely outpace nearly everyone else at 7,000, 7,300 at the higher capacities of 1, 2 and 4 TB, reading my notes, and the sequential writes performance on the 1 TB of 6,000 and at the 2 and 4 TB of 6,900 megabytes per second, massively overshadowing everyone else. But on top of that, it's the IOPS. They hit that 1 million IOPS threshold at the 1, 2 and 4 TB as well. It is a very enduring drive. Another reason why it super annoys me that I'm going to take advantage of the 500 gig. I could have delayed this video. I'm just going to make an updated one shortly with the larger capacity as it arrives. But it's the durability that they're banking on at 0.7 drive writes per day. And 0.7 being 70% drive capacity, so over 1 TB. That means that you can write, obviously delete afterwards, madness, 700 gigabytes per day throughout that 5-year period if you chose to, and the drive would still maintain that high performance threshold. I'm not suggesting you're going to do that, gamers, and put 700 gig on a day, but it means that that drive can withstand more writes have a better endurance factor and sustainability beyond the 5-year period, which I think is the real key takeaway here. Yes, it's expensive, but that's very important. They even chuck in that free data recovery service, which again, I know it seems like I'm over plugging them, but I think it's important that we understand why Seagate brought this out later than anyone else, when generally we have got used to in the last few years Seagate bringing the larger capacities to market first, bringing the lower prices first, and now all of a sudden they've released a solution here that is more expensive than everyone else and is arriving later than everyone else, something we've not really seen Seagate do before. So it's either an incredibly mature decision on their part or a bit of a snafu, something I'm looking forward for the testing to show us. I mean, the SSD inside here, this is a single-sided SSD we have here. So on the back here, we've got no chips whatsoever. We've only got there on the back. And if we lift up that label, let's delicately get that off. We are going to use a heatsink, don't worry. When we test this, we'll be able to take a good look at what we've got inside there. And as you can see, we've got the nice distribution of the NAND inside there. We've got the controller there at the bottom. We've got our memory. We've got NAND chips to either side. Again, not a terrible SSD. Lovely petite build as well, being on the single side. And I think it's only at the 2 TB that it goes double. Inside, if we go through the accessories, there's a weird thing in here. And again, hopefully someone at Seagate can tell me. The labels, I mean, what? I mean, don't get me wrong. Everybody loves a sticker, but I'm not really seeing myself utilising this much in the future, I've got to say. Maybe I'll slam one of these on my laptop, I'm not sure. But again, that's very 2000 for me. We've got information on that 5-year warranty, of course. But what's really cool is that rescue recovery service. Information on how to register your device and how to take advantage of that data recovery. And again, it is forensic level, it's third party. It's not just software led, although there are options. They will break it down. We did it with the hard drives in previous testing, where we did some forced destruction of a drive and they recovered the majority of the data. So they do stand by what they're doing, and it is inclusive. But let's get this drive onto the test machine. Let's see what this 500 gig drive can do. And again, remember, 500 gig, meaning that these performance benchmarks have to be viewed relative to that capacity. Let's not look at this and go, well, it was meant that if you're looking at the 4 TB, make sure you get those speeds correct. Let's jump onto the test machine, run this through a bunch of benchmark software, and then head back here into the studio and go through those results. Right, so we've made our way onto the desktop here, and I've installed the Seagate, and as you can see here on screen, there's the Seagate Firecuda, the 530 there. It's the 500 gig model. We are utilising transfer protocol PCIe times 4, and that's 4 times 4, and we are using NVMe 1.4, so we're all ticked, the boxes are done. Right, so let's go ahead and play with this drive a little bit, shall we? I have already installed this on here. I've already added it on the managed disks. As mentioned in my other videos when I've performed benchmarks on these drives, I am utilising OBS for this part of the recording, but I don't use OBS during the middle of the recording because it does affect performance results. When you are using OBS simultaneously on the machine you are using, it's a conflicting read-write issue. But I will be utilising a whole barrage of different pieces of software for testing today. We're going to be using Atto Disk Benchmark. Sorry about it, the screen goes black there occasionally. That's the Windows pop-up warning. We're going to be looking at Atto Disk Benchmark, utilising the Firecuda. We're also going to be utilising Crystal Disk Mark here, and it's going to be utilising different size drive numbers, and we're going to be using balanced read-writes as well at one point. And we are going to be using SSD benchmark as well in 1, 3 and 5 gigabyte sizes. So we have a whole host of tests that we're going to be performing. And just to give you some idea of what I was mentioning earlier on, here is AJA if we select the Firecuda. And if I run the speed test now, we're getting fairly terrible performance there because of the recording that we're doing here in the background. And that's why I'm going to have to cease recording with OBS, do the test, and then go through the results one by one with you in just a moment. We can see that the temperature's probably gone up ever so slightly there while we've been running some of our tests. But for now, why don't we finish up all of these tests, and I'll see you after all of these tests have been performed. Right, so the tests have been completed, and I'll be honest, for the most part, I am impressed. If we have a look there, of course, at the top left, that's the big news up there. The sequential read-write and the averaged read-write there at the top are pretty good. Now, to put those into perspective, if we have a look at Seagate's own data sheet here, we can scroll along and we can see over here on the right-hand side, let's zoom in a little bit there, shall we? The one that we want to look at here is that 500 gig model, because remember, we got to stay relative. Yes, the higher capacities have got these higher promised 7/6, but right now we need to focus on the 5, so we've got some sense of objectivity. And I'll be honest, it stands up. Here we are at the 1 gigabyte test here at the top of the screen, and the 1 gigabyte test file there did give us over 7,000 megabytes per second sequential read, and even exceeded their own stats there on sequential write, 3,700. Of course, once you go for the smaller 4K files, the tiny ones, things do change quite rapidly. And if we have a look at the reported IOPS, we did exceed read IOPS there, but we were slightly under what they reported as their own there. As we went into other tests, so that's the 1 gigabyte, we moved it into a 4 gigabyte test area there. And on the 4 gigabyte test, we can see that again, we cracked 7,000 and we were still over that 3,000 there. And we were at 3,700. So again, exceeded there. Had we been utilising some 3-4 grand test rig, I'm sure we would have seen even slightly better results there, but I do think we were kind of capping things quite high there. And the IOPS there still continuing over 4,000 there on the read IOPS too. Moving into an even bigger file, so this is a 16 gigabyte test file there. Once again, still breaking the 7,000 megs there, still breaking that 3,000 megs at 3,744 sequential write there. And again, I was quite pleased with those Crystal Disk benchmark scores there. Now, when we moved onto AS disk mark there, we did see some varying results. It's worth highlighting that when you do use AS disk benchmark, it does give you a slightly different picture there if we go into the reported settings there. So again, the read at 5,000 write over 3,000. And again, if you read most reviews, this is kind of what you end up seeing with AS. AS measures things ever so slightly differently. And again, if we look back to some of our older reviews when we were looking at some of the higher end PCIe Gen 4 reviews, like the ones we're looking at today, these do bear through. All of them living on AS, at least on my test rig, I hate seagulls, around that 5 to close to 5,500 there. So again, these are quite respectable stand-up scores there from AS Disk Benchmark. Again, for the 500 gig model, gotta stay relative. If we chop those down, we can then move on to the Atto Disk benchmark figures here. Now, we did 3 tests. We did a 256 megabyte test here. And if we move away from the IOPS there, we can see that in terms of write, it did not really wow us, but it still massively overplayed that 3,000 it was suggesting there. So it did at least break into that 3,500, but I do think that's kind of the top end there. And in terms of the read activity there, we did cap out at the maximum at 6,560 megabytes per second, or 6.5 gigabytes per second. So again, some great figures there, but Atto, with its more extensive changes in its file type structure there, gave us a much more wider report. Moving on to a 1 gigabyte test file, we can see if we overlap those numbers that again, that 3,500 there capped neatly all the way along. It was kind of hitting its head on the roof for the most part there. And if we have a look, they all line up pretty neatly there in terms of sequential read. Finally, we tested a 4 gigabyte test file on Atto. Let's bring that along. And we can see there, once again, very similar result all the way across the board, still managing that 3,500 write because it's the 500 gig. And when we do the testing on hopefully the 2 TB model very, very soon, we should see respectable benchmarks that are indicative of what we see on the data sheet there. And that seems like I'm making excuses, but it's just, I don't want anyone to come away from this thinking that the performance we're looking at for this 500 gig is what they're going to get for the higher ones. It just really isn't. And I think I would be doing any SSD a disservice to say otherwise. The last thing I'll mention is when I was taking some of the images for the article that presumably is live in the description, the other thing I did was to test AJA. Now, AJA is a performance benchmark tool, and it does repeated writes of different kinds of file format here. And this is a heavy HD file there. Let's bring that up. We can see there, this is the 16 gigabyte file, a massive 16 gig file, and it was very consistent activity all the way through with regards to read and write capture there. So again, living there at the 4009, reads at the, it peaked at one point to 5.4, but I think we can agree that is around the 5,000 or 5,001 mark there. And again, we can move into the 4 gigabyte test file, and again, the 4 gigabyte test file, quite respectable numbers, quite comparable, arguably, to what we've seen before. So if we have a look there, again, slightly similar, but the 16 gig being a larger, chunkier file gave us better writes. But in terms of read, the 4 gigabyte file was probably better overall. And finally, we can move into the 1 gigabyte, the smallest test file there. And in the case of the smallest test file there, we'll compare that. Again, it was as it was going through each of the sequences there between activity, it still managed to maintain quite decent little highs there. And if we compare that against that of the 16, sorry, that's the wrong one there, the 16 gig file, we can see that those, performance speeds there still held up between the small and the big file all the way through. And the drive itself, the temperature wasn't too shabby. I think the highest it got to with the heatsink on board was 42 C on there. You can see it's been powered on now. It's actually just shy. I think it's between an hour, maybe an hour and a half. I'm sure the clock at the bottom will let us know what that is. But for now, let's make our way back into the studio and summarize everything we've learned about the Firecuda 530 and whether we think it's a decent drive. So, unsurprisingly, I think we all know that I am a fan of this drive. I've not really held that back. But what I've been trying to do while reviewing this drive, not just on a spec level and utility level or just as the brand, but also whether it actually does what they say it will do. Now, it's very hard to prove any of those statements about durability from them. That's something I think that only time will tell. I will say that in the performance benchmarks, it pretty much confirmed everything I wanted it to about that performance in a PC environment. I will say it did run hot. This is one of the SSDs that, although Crystal Dismart did show us that the temperature there, I think it went to about 41 overall, it did run hot very, very quickly. And although there is its own first-party heatsink that you can get for this drive, I didn't have that for this review, but I did take advantage of a big old chunky heatsink there in the background. And even then, it still raised a little bit. So I do think this is an SSD that I wouldn't recommend utilising without some kind of heatsink, be it first or third party. Do I think Seagate did the right thing by working on that additional NAND and ultimately delaying the release of this product? I think so. I think if they're going to make this focus about it being a more mature product, it makes sense to me to focus on durability. There is the argument, of course, that gamers aren't going to use sequential write anywhere near as much as sequential read. But I will say, with a growing community of streamers on things like Twitch and people professionally gaming online for hours and hours and hours a day, I think a balanced SSD that not only gives that large performance in sequential read, needs to give sequential write later down the line. And I do think with the growth of esports and the growth of streaming as a whole, they did the right thing there with this SSD. Now, would I recommend it? Of course I would. I do think this is one of the best PCIe Gen 4 SSDs that I've ever used. I do maintain that I think it's really changed what I think about what an SSD should give, because I've never really, it's not that I don't give thought to durability, but with so many of us focusing on performance over and over and over again, I think it's very easy for us to forget that while with SSD we demand this high performance, that at the same time we don't think about its intrinsic impact on the hardware. We hear about sports cars that can crack so many 100 miles an hour, but we don't think about if we actually had a never-ending stretch of road, just how detrimental that would be to the car as a whole. And these performance benchmarks are designed to give you that performance, but it doesn't give you a mean time to work it within. And I think a lot of brands could do well to focus on that durability more and more when down the line the average consumer that isn't really informed about durability suddenly starts seeing their drive start to slow down, suddenly has failure, and then the brand goes, well, we did tell you the durability, didn't we? And I don't think that's that fair. I think it's a good product. maybe a pinch more expensive than it should be. I think maybe one of the errors that Seagate did, of course, was releasing the 520 series. The 520 was, one would argue, a stopgap. They released a PCIe Gen 4 SSD before this one, and I think releasing this when they could have pushed towards this where possible, maybe the pandemic had a problem, somehow watered down this drive's impact. But I do like this SSD and I do recommend it. And for those of you in the comments that I'm fairly certain are about to type out that, oh, well, they sent him a free SSD, of course he did it. I bought this with my money. I paid for this drive, and I would, if I didn't like it, I'll tell you. But for me, this is still one of easily the SSDs to beat right now in 2021. It brings you that performance, but it also brings a mature stance on durability. And yes, it's more expensive, but think of the long term, think of the value, think about the money it saves over time. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this review. We will be doing a lot more comparisons with this SSD, both in the context of PS5 and outside of it in the wonderful world of data storage very, very soon. I hope you enjoyed this video. Do let me know if you did. Again, another shout out to that review on Tweaktown. Do check it out. It's a larger capacity drive, and they do have the performance benchmarks that do bear fruit with regards to the larger capacities living up to that performance that I couldn't give you today. Click like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe to learn more, and if you are looking for a data storage solution, do take advantage of the free advice section over on NAS Compares. It's made by me and Eddie the Web Guy. It's completely free. It might take us an extra day or two to answer you, but we answer every inquiry eventually. Do take advantage. It's free. Why not? Otherwise, I shall see you on the next video.